The air in the monastery was thick with the scent of incense and old stone, a mixture that spoke of centuries of quiet devotion. But tonight that silence was broken. The abbey bell tolled ominously, its deep, resonant chime rolling through the valley like a warning. I stood in the cavernous nave, my breath forming faint clouds in the cold air, staring at the gaping void where the monastery's most sacred artifact had once rested. The relic of Saint Amara, a silver chalice inlaid with opal said to hold miraculous healing powers, was gone. It had vanished overnight, leaving behind nothing but a faint scorch mark on the velvet pedestal where it had rested for centuries. "I don't understand," Father Aurelian murmured, his voice trembling. The abbot was a slight man, his age etched into the lines of his face. His hands shook as he clutched a rosary, the beads clicking softly as they passed through his fingers. The relic was under lock and key. No one could have entered without... Without what? I asked, my voice low. The monastery's high arches seemed to amplify every word, making my own sound alien, almost intrusive. Father Aurelian hesitated, glancing toward the shadows that pooled in the corners of the nave. His gaze lingered there, as if he expected something, or someone, to emerge. Without divine permission, he whispered, his words barely audible. I didn't reply. The implications of such a statement were too heavy, too absurd. Instead, I let my eyes wander, scanning the cold, unyielding stone walls and the faintly flickering candles. The shadows seemed to move in the dim light, shifting and curling like smoke. A trick of the flame, I told myself. Nothing more. Yet, an unease prickled at the back of my neck. Something about this theft felt wrong. Father Aurelian broke the silence, his voice unsteady. You have solved mysteries before, have you not? That is why we called you here. I nodded. I had been drawn into this world of artifacts and antiquities years ago, a historian turned investigator by necessity. But this was unlike anything I had encountered before. The air itself seemed heavy, as though the walls carried secrets too vast to speak. Who had access to the reliquary? I asked, kneeling to examine the pedestal more closely. The scorch mark was faint, but undeniable, a perfect circle, its edges too clean to be natural. No one, the abbot replied. The reliquary is sealed every evening at Vespers. The key never leaves my possession. And yet, I said, gesturing to the empty pedestal, someone managed to take it. Father Aurelian crossed himself. It is not just the theft that troubles me, but what might follow. The relic is not merely sacred, it is a ward. Without it, the monastery is vulnerable. To what? I asked, rising to my feet. The abbot did not answer. His eyes darted toward the flickering shadows, and his silence spoke volumes. The auction house was hidden in plain sight, a nondescript building at the edge of the city, its peeling facade masking the opulence within. The air was thick with the scent of old books and faintly metallic, like blood on rust. I passed through the grand double doors, feeling the weight of a dozen eyes on me as I entered the hall. Inside, the room was a blend of elegance and secrecy. Velvet drapes lined the walls, muffling sound, and crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across an array of priceless artifacts. Every whispered conversation was drowned out by the quiet hum of anticipation. It was a place where treasures changed hands, where history was bought and sold, but not always legally. I scanned the room, my eyes lingering on the small stage where items were discreetly displayed. The chalice was nowhere to be seen, but then I hadn't expected it to be. Looking for something specific? The voice came from my left, smooth and sharp, like silk wrapped around a blade. I turned to find a man in a tailored suit, his smile too knowing, his eyes too cold. Just browsing, I replied, keeping my tone light. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I forced myself to stay rooted, my hands gripping the strap of my satchel like a lifeline. "Rare items often draw curious minds," he said, his gaze drifting toward the stage. "Especially those with extraordinary histories." "Is that what you deal in?" I asked, matching his casual tone. He chuckled softly. "History is such a subjective thing, don't you think? One man's treasure is another man's curse." The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring me to ask more. But before I could reply, the lights dimmed and the room fell silent. A new item was brought to the stage, a statue carved from black obsidian, its surface glinting under the spotlight. As the auctioneer began his spiel, the man beside me leaned in. "Beware of chasing shadows," he murmured. "They have a habit of leading you places you'd rather not go." And with that, he melted into the crowd, leaving behind only the faintest scent of something acrid and metallic. I stayed for another hour, watching as relic after relic was paraded before the audience. But there was no sign of the chalice. It wasn't until I was leaving that I spotted it, a flicker of silver in the hands of a hooded figure slipping out the back door. Heart pounding, I followed. The alley was dark, the air cold and damp. The figure moved quickly, their steps silent, their path deliberate. They didn't turn as I followed, but somehow I knew they were aware of me. When they finally stopped, it was at the edge of a small park. They turned just enough for me to catch a glimpse of their face beneath the hood. An ordinary face, except for the eyes. They were too bright, too sharp, glinting like polished glass. "The chalice doesn't belong to you," I said, my voice steady despite the unease curling in my gut. The figure smiled, a slow, deliberate thing that sent a chill down my spine. "You don't know what it belongs to." And with that, they were gone, melting into the shadows like smoke. As I stood there, the weight of their words settled over me, heavy and unyielding. Whatever I had stumbled into, it was far more dangerous than I had anticipated. And the shadows around me seemed to agree, their shapes shifting as though alive, watching, waiting. The ruins were a desolate labyrinth carved into the side of an arid cliff. Wind howled through the narrow passages, carrying with it the faint scent of dry earth and something sharper. Decay, perhaps, though there was no life here to rot. The cryptic map I'd uncovered among the monastery's archives had led me here, each turn etched with markings that grew more enigmatic the deeper I ventured. I stood at the threshold of the tomb's entrance, staring at the worn stone adorned with unfamiliar glyphs. They glowed faintly in the dim light, as if alive. I hesitated, a chill slithering down my spine despite the desert's warmth. The glyphs seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, their patterns twisting like living things caught mid-movement. "You've come far," a voice rasped behind me. Startled, I spun to find a cloaked figure standing a few paces away. Their face was obscured, their presence sudden and unannounced. "Who are you?" I demanded, forcing my voice to remain steady. They didn't answer immediately. Instead, they gestured toward the tomb with a gloved hand. "You'll find what you seek in there, but beware. This place was built to contain, not to preserve." "Contain what?" I asked, but they were already walking away, their footsteps making no sound on the dusty ground. Left alone, I had no choice but to proceed. My flashlight illuminated the narrow passage beyond the entrance, the beam catching faint carvings on the walls. The further I went, the more the carvings seemed to depict something, scenes of figures bowing before a chalice, their faces twisted in expressions I couldn't decide were reverence or terror. The air grew colder, the silence oppressive. My own breathing sounded deafening as I descended deeper into the tomb. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, just on the edge of perception. It wasn't a voice, not really, but a susurration of thoughts, like wind brushing against my mind. The whispers grew louder as I entered a chamber that opened suddenly, its ceiling arching impossibly high. At its center stood a pedestal, the stone around it worn smooth as though countless hands had reached for what it once held. The chalice. It must have rested here once, its absence leaving a strange energy in the air, as though the stone still remembered its weight. The whispering intensified, spiraling into a cacophony of fragmented words. I couldn't understand them, but their intent was clear. Leave. A shadow moved in the corner of my vision, and I spun, shining my flashlight toward it. Nothing. But I knew I wasn't alone. The shadows along the walls seemed to writhe, shifting unnaturally in the light. The sense of being watched was suffocating. On the far wall something gleamed, a series of intricate glyphs carved deeper than the others. They pulsed faintly, their edges shimmering as though touched by firelight. I stepped closer, the whispers clawing at my mind, and traced my fingers over the carvings. The moment my skin touched the stone, the chamber seemed to sigh, the air rushing past me as if released from some ancient hold. My head swam with the weight of a sudden vision, a swirling torrent of images. A hooded figure raising the chalice, dark shapes spiraling from its depths, a ritual older than the tomb itself. The glyphs flared brightly, and I stumbled back, gasping. The vision left a single phrase etched into my mind, spoken by a voice that wasn't mine. The chalice binds the curse. Break it, and the curse is unbound. The cult's lair was hidden beneath the ruins of an abandoned cathedral, its entrance concealed by a weathered stone altar that slid aside with a faint groan. The air here was heavier, colder, as though the earth itself bore the weight of the secrets it held. The winding stairs led me down into a cavern lit only by the eerie glow of candles placed in deliberate, ritualistic patterns. I kept to the shadows, my heart pounding as I moved closer to the central chamber. The sound of chanting reached me, low, rhythmic, and unsettling. The words were in no language I recognized, each syllable carrying a weight that seemed to resonate in my bones. The room I entered was vast and circular, its walls lined with intricate carvings that mirrored those in the tomb. At its center, the chalice rested on a raised dais, its surface gleaming with an unnatural light. Around it knelt a circle of hooded figures, their voices intertwining in a hypnotic chant. My eyes were drawn to the chalice. It pulsed faintly, as though alive, and the air around it shimmered with heat despite the chill in the cavern. A shadow coiled within its depths, a dark shape that moved like liquid smoke, writhing as though yearning to escape. The leader of the cult stepped forward, lowering their hood to reveal a face I recognized. Father Aurelian. My breath caught as he raised his arms, his voice cutting through the chant like a blade. The chalice holds the binding, the last tether to the old world's curse. Tonight, we release it and reclaim what was promised. His words echoed, and the shadows in the cavern seemed to grow darker, reaching toward the chalice like grasping hands. The artifact's glow intensified, casting long, jagged shapes on the walls. I pressed myself against the cold stone, my mind racing. If the chalice was the binding, then destroying it might unleash the curse, a power too great to comprehend. But if I let the ritual continue, the cult would wield that power, bending it to their will. Aurelian stepped closer to the chalice, his voice rising. The chosen key is here, the bearer of the curse's mark. Step forward. Panic clawed at me as every hooded figure turned toward the shadows where I hid. I hadn't realized until that moment what Aurelian's words meant. The key wasn't the chalice. It was me. Their gazes pierced through the shadows as though I were already standing in the center of the chamber, the invisible mark of the curse glowing like a beacon to their eyes. The air thickened, pressing against my chest, and the chanting resumed, louder, and more insistent. It seemed to crawl into my mind, fraying the edges of my thoughts. Father Aurelian's voice rose above the hum, resonant and commanding. You were drawn here, not by chance, but by design. The chalice knows you, as does the binding. Step forward, or risk the unraveling. My body betrayed me, one step falling after another. It wasn't the cultist's eyes that compelled me. It was the chalice itself. Its faint pulsing matched the rhythm of my heartbeat, its glow brighter with every step I took. The shadow coiling within it surged against the rim, desperate, eager. As I reached the edge of the dais, the chanting ceased, plunging the room into a silence so profound it seemed alive. Aurelian extended his hand, gesturing toward the chalice. Take it, he whispered. His voice, though soft, carried the weight of inevitability. I hesitated, staring into the swirling darkness that churned inside the chalice. The visions from the tomb returned in jagged fragments, images of cities collapsing into shadow, the sky burning red, and the earth splitting under the weight of an unleashed curse. You feel it, don't you? Aurelian continued, his tone reverent. The choice is yours. To break the binding is to free what was contained, but in doing so, the curse may spread untethered. To leave it bound is to doom this place to its endless hunger. My hand hovered over the chalice. Its surface radiated a strange heat that seemed to reach through the air, pulling at my skin. The shadow inside pulsed, growing larger, its form twisting into faint, indistinct shapes, faces perhaps, or something far worse. I don't want this, I whispered, my voice trembling. The admission hung in the air like a fragile thread, but no answer came. Aurelian stepped closer, his presence suffocating. You were chosen, because you bear the will to decide. But know this, the chalice binds not just the curse, but what little remains of its light. To break it is to destroy both. The weight of his words pressed against my chest. Light and shadow, bound together. The chalice wasn't merely a prison, it was a precarious balance. I closed my eyes, the enormity of the choice paralyzing me. The cavern trembled softly, the air quivering with an otherworldly hum. The figures around me knelt, their heads bowed as though in prayer. Shadows writhed along the walls, twisting into shapes that defied comprehension. The chalice's glow intensified, searing against my closed eyelids, forcing me to open them. Aurelian's expression was expectant, his outstretched hand trembling slightly. He seemed neither villain nor savior in that moment, only a man consumed by faith in a power he could never truly understand. Choose before the curse chooses for you. I looked once more into the chalice, its shadow surging upward as if sensing the weight of my thoughts. It reached for me, and this time I let it. The shadow coiled around my fingers, its touch cold and intangible, like smoke seeping through my skin. A voice echoed in my mind, layered and indistinct, as though 1,000 whispers spoke in unison. To break is to free, to bind is to hold. What are you willing to lose? I didn't know the answer, but I did know one thing. The chalice couldn't remain here, not in the hands of the cult, nor within this place steeped in ancient suffering. It needed to be taken away, to a place where neither shadow nor light could tip the scales. My hand closed around the chalice. The moment I lifted it, the cavern erupted in motion. Shadows swirled like a tempest, the walls groaning as though they might collapse. The cultists cried out, their voices drowned by the unearthly roar that filled the space. Aurelian fell to his knees, his eyes wide with something between awe and terror. You take it? I take it, I said, my voice firm despite the fear twisting in my chest. But I do not break it. The shadows recoiled as though struck, shrinking back into the corners of the cavern. The chalice's glow dimmed, its heat receding as the shadow within it grew still. A strange calm settled over the room, though the air still thrummed with latent energy, like a storm waiting to break. Without another word, I turned and walked back toward the stairs. The cultists parted before me, their eyes downcast, their chants silenced. Aurelian's voice rose behind me one final time, faint and laced with something I couldn't name. The choice you made is not the end. It is only the beginning. As I climbed the stairs, the chalice pulsing faintly in my hands, I felt the truth of his words settle deep in my bones. The shadows didn't follow, but their presence lingered, a reminder of what the chalice carried, and what it could become. When I emerged into the cold night air, the stars seemed brighter, the wind sharper. The chalice felt heavier than before, as though it knew the burden it had placed on me. And in the distant silence, I thought I heard the faintest whisper, a promise of something still waiting in the dark.